ocean. 70% of the world's surface is covered with water. For some, the sea proved an impregnable wall. You can't walk on water, nor swim very far. If you lived on an island, you were stuck. Going out in a small boat could have you destroyed by a storm, or starve to death in the middle of nowhere. But for those able to harness the dangers of the ocean, it meant total freedom. Travel by sea was much, much faster than travel by land. Terrain was hard, roads were poor, and motorized equipment did not exist. If I had a wagon and a horse and wanted to deliver a shipment of grain from Estonia to Lübeck, the grain would rot before I reached my destination. But if I traveled by ship, I could arrive in maybe a week, meaning that the shipment would be intact and could be sold at the market. But why stop at grain? With the ocean we can go much farther and get more expensive goods. Chocolate from America, or pepper from Asia. The development of the sailing ship led to globalization, capitalism, and eventually, industrialization. The ocean became the highway of empires. This was called the maritime lines of communication. These lines were used for trade, as we discussed, but also the exchange of information, transportation, and power projection. The maritime lines of communication were the pulsating veins of early modern countries. It's not a strange conclusion that warfare at sea is a contest of controlling these lines. Control allows your country to trade, communicate and transport, and forbids the enemy from doing the same. It allows you to defend your country from amphibious invasions and to invade the enemy. This constant conflict between competing nations led Europe to produce permanent, professional navies, the first of its kind, that were able to dominate the global ocean. But these navies didn't come out of nowhere. Before them, there was nothing. Boats have, of course, been around for a pretty long time. And contrary to popular belief, the Middle Ages saw a lot of technological development, not the least in shipbuilding. In the early Middle Ages, boats looked like this. In the late, they looked like this. Whilst medieval times were inventive, they weren't very bureaucratic. Administration sucked, and countries were decentralized, almost non-existent. Navies simply did not exist. Most ships were privately owned by merchants. The king didn't have enough money or power to build a navy. This meant that he couldn't protect the merchants, meaning that he couldn't tax them. This was a major revenue loss, and really a circle that led nowhere. Kings would sponsor pirates to attack these merchants, both to harm their enemy and to make some profit themselves. But as pirates often do, they usually did whatever they wanted. Medieval navies were temporary groupings, hastily assembled for a specific purpose during times of war. That was, if the army had no other choice but to cross a body of water. Then the king would either order the hasty construction of simple transports, or more often than not, hire merchant ships as mercenaries. Medieval sea battles were far out and in between, and were really just an extension of land engagements. They occurred when two transporting armies met each other on the water. Then they engaged in what was essentially a land battle, with the boats as floating platforms. Ships would grapple each other, and one party of armored guys would board the other and try to kill them. The biggest advantage in ancient and medieval sea battles was height. If your ship was just higher than the enemy, they couldn't get aboard. Thus, you were free to throw down whatever arrows and rocks you wanted. Usually, the cannon is given credit for advancing the development of navies. However, the first naval gunpowder weapons were swivel guns, which were anti-personnel. It was loaded from the breech with nails or stones and could damage the enemy crew or confuse them with its smoke. It wasn't until the latter half of the 1400s that heavy cannon were mounted on ships. Now, there's going to be some smartass in the comment section who's going to ask, but what about galleys? This video concerns the development of sail ships. Galleys, which are not sail ships and really shouldn't be called a ship at all, were developed very differently and were never able to affect global affairs like the sail ship. Thus, I covered the history of the galley fleet in its own separate video, which you can go and watch. It wasn't the cannon per se that led to the initial rise of permanent navies, rather it was the increasingly organizational ability of rulers. The late Middle Ages had been, to put it mildly, a pretty bad time. France and England had casually fought each other for 100 years, and things looked the same in Scandinavia, Spain and much of the rest of Europe. Civil wars and dynastic conflicts were every day. At the end of the 1400s, people realized, hey, maybe we should stop fighting each other and try to become friends instead. In countries like France, England and Castile, local aristocrats became willing to cooperate with the king and establish organization. This was achieved by consent and compromise, rather than coercion and a large bureaucracy. The king and his aristocrats wanted the same thing, to expand their own power. Princes of this time aimed to establish a monopoly of violence. This was usually achieved by having a large army that could defend the population against internal and external threats. In return, the plebs would pay a tax. But if you have a large coast or live on an island, you need a navy to defend yourself. Technically, a navy also allowed you to conquer other territories, but that never really happened during this period. A monopoly of violence at sea also meant that princes could defend his fisheries and commerce. Trade had skyrocketed in the 1400s. The invention of three-masted ships and superior hulls made it safer to travel in the nautically demanding Atlantic and northern European waters. This led to the rise of nautical entrepôts like London and Amsterdam. The state might organize convoys and create a system of taxation to pay for protection. Taxation was a huge revenue. In Brittany, the Admiralty provided the state with almost half of its annual income by selling protection to the shipping industry. This allowed the duchy to establish a permanent navy. When France formed a dynastic union with the duchy, Brittany's navy formed the backbone of the French sailing fleet. In France and also the Habsburg Netherlands, protection at sea was managed by provincial admirals and admiralties. In England, the Admiralty courts were legal institutions concerned with policing piracy. One of the important feats of Renaissance rulers was the introduction of laws that distinguished piracy from lawful privateering and private protection against violence. This further expanded the state's monopoly of violence at sea and thus increased their control. However, the Tudor Navy of England was directly administered by Henry VIII himself, with the help of professional specialists. This was also the case in Portugal, Denmark and Sweden. Renaissance rulers used the latest shipbuilding innovations to their advantage. The improved sailing ship and the heavy naval gun are regarded as revolutionary and of decisive importance for European and global expansion. Improved sail ships improved the ability of the ship to stay at sea under adverse conditions and to use the wind as a safe source of energy. Starting in the latter half of the 1400s, ship carpenters began cutting square holes in the sides of their ships, called gun ports. Hint, that's where they put cannons. But initially, these heavy guns weren't used to destroy their ships. Rather, they were used to bombard coastal fortifications. The first development of sea artillery was essentially an experiment to see if ships could be used as floating siege platforms. The French were perhaps the first to use gun-armed sailing ships for ship-to-ship combat. La Cordelière was the largest and carried 16 heavy guns. As part of a fleet built in Normandy, she saw service in the Mediterranean against the Italians and Turks. This gave the French Atlantic Navy considerable experience in long-distance expeditions and the use of guns against ships and targets on land. The early gun-carrying ships were massive. Some weighed 2,000 tons, and they were essentially floating castles. Aside from La Cordelière, they included the Mary Rose from England and the Scottish Michael, armed with 27 heavy guns. They were still built with the medieval philosophy that warfare at sea revolved around boarding combat. With high sides, they could easily fend off borders, and the raised sections allowed archers and gunners to pepper the enemy. Since the gun ports were spaced out and the ships weren't built straight, the cannons couldn't fire in a coordinated broadside. Thus, the cannons were mostly a defensive weapon to fend off borders. This design philosophy proved to be flawed. The development of the cannon turned naval combat into a contest of outmaneuvering the enemy, rather than just sitting still and defending yourself against borders. Henry VIII had built a massive ship called the Mary Rose, armed with 28 heavy cannons. In battle, she proved too clumsy to steer around and was outmaneuvered by French galleys. When the Mary Rose tried turning around, she just capsized and sank. The galley was the first vessel to properly harness the cannon as an effective naval weapon. The sailing ship still needed time to be developed as a properly maneuverable vessel, able to effectively use cannons. One exception lies outside of Europe, where the Portuguese and Spanish were able to sink large fleets of Asian pirates with their naval artillery. But that's because the Asian ships were of poor quality and insufficient at boarding the massive European sail ships. Historians are also uncertain how effective the cannons themselves actually were. Some argue they were weaker because they used cannonballs made from stone, but these were just as good as iron, just costlier to produce, especially after an increase in the wages of stonemasons. Rather, the early cannons were grafted together from several pieces and connected with iron hoops. They could only fire weaker powder charges as a result. Neither do we really know how they were actually mounted or reloaded. Gun carriages were rudimentary and often used field carriages. Some cannons were breech-loaded, which further decreased their power. Others seem to have been reloaded from outside of the ship, which exposed the reloader to enemy missiles. Longer cannons might not have been able to properly recoil back into the ship. Sea battles were quite uncommon in this era, so historians have had a hard time studying formations and tactics. The results of sea battles from this era are often brief and fragmentary. It seems the case that the sailing fleets were improvised and incoherent, and favored defensive combat. For offensive operations, commanders favored boarding combat or the use of galleys. The large ships formed a vanguard, which broke into the enemy formations. The smaller ships in the group supported them to the best of their ability. Cohesion within groups of ships and loyalty to a group commander might compensate for the lack of professional training and the difficulties of controlling a major fleet from a flagship. Whilst the early Renaissance saw great political integration, few revolts and gradual consolidation of centralized power, large parts of Western Europe faced a sudden political collapse between 1560 and 1600. France faced religious turmoil and civil wars between Catholics and Protestants. In the Netherlands, political and religious conflicts led to an armed revolt against Spanish hegemony. This blossomed from a civil war into a national conflict between the Spanish and Dutch. Spain had used to roll the die. They had established a hegemony over Western Europe and a large colonial empire in the Americas, from which they could harvest shiploads of silver and gold. With the Spanish collapse, sailors from England, France, and the Netherlands realized that they could get in on this cash. Using the innovative sailing ships, they were able to cross the Atlantic and force interaction with the Spanish colonies. Now, Spain wanted full, autistic control over their colonies and didn't allow for any external trade. But the problem was that they lacked an Atlantic navy. All of their colonial trading and business was entirely managed through private enterprise. They just didn't have a navy. This is further evidence that the transitional navy of the early Renaissance was an entirely top-down effort. It can also be argued that it was developed as a defensive, protection-selling measure. Evidence for this is that Spain didn't have any naval threats in the Americas, except for some Indians in canoes. Simply put, there had been no reason to establish an Atlantic Spanish navy. Now they couldn't prevent foreigners from doing whatever they wanted. French corsairs burned down Havana in 1566. However, these corsairs were just as likely to do peaceful trade with the colonies, and the Spanish colonies were very receptive to them. This era saw the rise of private naval enterprises. Merchants and sailors realized that there was money to be made from violent action by sea, both trading and pirating. Whilst the French were unable to harness this energy, the English and Dutch would use it to establish their modern navies. The Spanish king had sold his Dutch navy after the peace in 1559. His lack of a permanent navy became apparent when the Dutch rebels in 1568 began to organize a force of privateers, known as the Sea Beggars. They were notoriously undisciplined and religious fanatics. No matter the country of origin, no ship was safe if they were Catholic, loyal to Spain, or carried enemy goods. The Sea Beggars operated closely with the French Huguenots and the English, and were remarkably effective. All of the Western European seaboard, from Emden to the Canaries, had been turned into a war zone. The attack soon extended to the Caribbean. After a lengthy blockade of the Spanish-occupied Netherlands, the Sea Beggars were able to induce a second revolution and occupy the city of Brill. From here they began to organize themselves into a provisional navy for the struggle of inland waterways and coastal regions. Thanks to their control of the sea route, the Dutch were able to make money and could sell licenses of trade. In France, the Protestant Huguenots had developed a sprawling seafaring community along the southern Atlantic seaboard, and was able to control the French activity at sea during the religious wars. Thus, the French government was unable to harness this energy into a commercial navy. In England, it was quite the opposite. Whilst Henry VIII had been a min-maxer and micromanager, Queen Elizabeth was more relaxed. She was very good at giving free reins to private interest groups to do as they liked at sea, so long as she got a cut from the profits. These interest groups were the Sea Dogs. They were men like Francis Drake, a golden example of this time's naval entrepreneur. He was part merchant, part slave trader, pirate, explorer, and naval commander. He and his colleagues established several naval administrations in England, such as economic assistance for crippled sailors, and adapted new naval technologies. Most important of these technologies were faster and more maneuverable ships. These were able to fully utilize the naval gun in combat. Cannons themselves had improved. England began to manufacture cast iron pieces, which were easier to produce and stronger than medieval guns, and cheaper than copper cannons. These also had four-wheeled truck carriages, which could easily recoil back into the ship, allowing them to be reloaded from safety. 1580 was a decisive year in the development of the Spanish Navy. Having signed a lasting treaty with the Turks, they could now turn their full attention to the Dutch and English. Since they had entered a dynastic union with Portugal in the same year, they had inherited the excellent Portuguese navy. The new Spanish navy first proved itself when it defeated a French navy that intended to restore Portugal's independence. The French fleet was formerly a private venture and was largely improvised. Spain had now consolidated its control over the southern Atlantic and was able to secure the shipment of American silver. Their attacks in the Netherlands reinvigorated. In 1688, they turned their attention to squashing England. The Spanish wanted to place a Catholic ruler on the throne. The period culminated in the 1688 Spanish Armada. Some historians view the Spanish Armada as the starting point, but really, it was the culmination of the early European navies which we have discussed until now. The Portuguese navy formed the nucleus of the Armada, but most of it was mobilized in the traditional Spanish manner, with armed merchantmen hired from Biscay, Andalusia, Italy, Ragusa, and Venice. They included the state-of-the-art galleons, the most powerful sailing warships. Armed warships called naus were very much built with the medieval philosophy. Urcas, transport ships, and finally 4 galleasses. The galleass was a hybrid sailing ship and a galley. Thanks to its maneuverability, it would actually prove the most effective vessel in the English Channel, though sadly underutilized by the Spanish. On the English side, purpose-built royal warships represented a much more important part than on the Spanish. Others were warships built for privateering. They had a huge advantage in firepower and maneuverability. The Spanish would only be able to win if they could get in close and board the English, which wasn't possible with their majority of clumsy merchantmen. And the Armada famously ended in a notorious disaster. The English gunnery proved superior to the Spanish lack of firepower. Poor winds forced the Spanish to sail around the British Isles. Weather and bad logistics took its toll, and casualties were staggering. Whilst this didn't result in the end of the Spanish Empire, as some would claim, it did prove that organized fleets of maneuverable, gun-armed vessels were superior to the medieval merchantmen. The greatest proof of this occurred in 1596, when an Anglo-Dutch fleet surprised the Spanish squadron in Cadiz. One of the largest flagships in the world, the San Felipe, was destroyed by English gunnery. Another 2 large warships were destroyed, and 2 more taken. 40 additional warships and merchantmen were burned. The English landed an army in Cadiz and destroyed parts of the city. Before 1650, this engagement was very much the apogee of English naval warfare. By the early 1600s, the naval conflict between Spain and the Dutch Republic had turned global. At every turn, from Asia to the Americas, the Dutch sought to undermine Spain's power at sea. This conflict at sea was economic, as much as it was naval. The Spanish had established a global empire, but rather than building a coherent system of world trade that connected their colonies with Europe, the Spanish elite wanted to use their power to deny much of Europe the possibility of trade. The main instrument of this policy became trade embargoes. This would deny their enemy the access to valuable Spanish goods and money. Their Dutch enemy operated under an entirely different policy. They sold license that allowed their merchants to trade with the enemy. Handel op den fiend. Trade with the enemy. This gave the state a valuable source of income and a hands-off ability to undermine Spanish economic power. The Dutch also created 2 monopoly companies for overseas trade and warfare in the Indian Ocean and Atlantic Sea. Der Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, VOC,
Die VOC-mentaliteit.
and the Westindische Compagnie, WEC.
Toch?
These companies were both able to successfully attack the enemy and promote their own economic activities. For example, in 1605 the VOC conquered the islands of Ambonia, Ternate and Tidore in the Moluccas. Under the protection of armed forces, the Dutch had established a profitable route of Asian spice trade. The Spanish and Portuguese were unable to emulate the company system. The English established their own monopoly companies, who often cooperated with the Dutch to battle the Iberians over control of Asian trade. And the Spanish embargo system was a failure. Whilst the Dutch lost access to Spanish ports in Europe, they gained trade with the rest of the world. Only Spain's dominions were damaged by the embargo policy. Dutch efficiency at sea led to Holland becoming the first central hub for world trade. Iberian maritime and commercial power declined dramatically. Technologically, the global trade war between the Dutch and Iberians proved that European fleets were able to operate anywhere in the world. The hulking merchant ships used by the Portuguese in Asia had become obsolete, as they were unable to operate during the monsoon season, compared to the lighter Dutch merchantmen. One of the most important naval innovations was the frigate. It was light but well armed and could sail at higher speed than earlier naval vessels. Interestingly enough, it was first constructed in Spanish-owned Flanders, though it never spread to Iberia itself. It was quickly adopted by the Dutch and English. Another popular innovation was the fire ship. These were vessels specifically designed to be set on fire and sicked on the enemy fleet like a living bomb. In Europe, both the Dutch and Spanish had established battle fleets. Unlike in the previous century, the French had stayed out of the naval game. In 1635 their naval interests slightly revived when they declared war on Spain. They won several engagements but were mostly reliant on their Dutch ally for naval supremacy. The most important battle occurred on the 16th of September, 1639, in the English Channel. The Spanish admiral had the wind on his side, but wanted to use a considerably traditional stratagem. He wanted to fight at close range, where musket fire and boarding would win the day. The Dutch, on the other hand, kept an open range and a straight battle line, concentrating their gunfire on distinct sections of the enemy fleet. However, the formation proved effective, as many ships were unable to bring their guns to bear. After 60 hours, both sides ran out of ammunition. The Spanish disengaged and took cover along the neutral English coast. The next month, the Dutch fleet returned. They had quickly mobilized a new fleet that was able to inflict a devastating defeat upon the Spanish. 32 Spanish warships were lost, and 6,000 men died. This decisive engagement is somewhat ironic, since the Dutch had shown little interest in European naval engagements. Their victory made the Dutch elite overconfident. They now believed that their society could improvise battle fleets at a very short notice. This foolish illusion was shattered in 1652, when they were defeated by a reinvigorated English navy. England spent the 1640s fighting a civil war between the monarchy and parliament. Interestingly, this civil war saw a remarkable increase in the size and efficiency of the English navy. By 1650, the English navy was the largest in the world and rapidly expanding. The English Commonwealth was introducing a new naval policy, where the permanent state navy would be able to both undertake major battle fleet operations and trade protection, and could be used to exert power overseas. In the Anglo-Dutch War of 1652, they were decisively able to defeat the Dutch fleet, who were forced to adapt the same policy. Thus, a new phase in naval warfare had begun. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.